Hi folks, and hello especially to Michael Vrazatulis. I may have said that wrong. Michael is somebody that I've been in touch with once in a while on YouTube. He's something of an occultist, something of a philosopher, and we generally have the same basic pantheistic outlook on life. So Michael made a video called Consciousness, Darrell Sloan and Michael W. Ford Combined. And he's really addressing the last video that I made, and he has some concerns about it. I'll link the video down below if you want to go watch it first, then come back here. That's up to you. But basically, Michael is worried that I'm being overly dismissive of individual consciousness, and that this may lead me to be more dismissive of the importance of individuality. Well, this video here is really to address those concerns and generally to provide something of interest for everybody who's watching. Anyway, Michael, nothing could be further from the truth. Individual consciousness is actually quite real. Let me say that for the record. When I say consciousness is not a tangible thing, that's not the same as saying consciousness is not real. Because time is not a tangible thing. There are no units of time, really. The units of time are in the way we measure it. Because, for instance, we can't really say that a unit of time is a second, because we can go inside that and we can look at the nanosecond. But the nanosecond isn't a fundamental unit of time either, because when we decided what a second was, that's only because we decided that a day should be split up into 12 hours, which should be split up into 60 minutes, which should be split up into 60 seconds. We could have chose other numbers. So if we had said that there are 50 seconds in a minute, then the nanosecond would be something else. So the more you move away from a classical understanding of the universe, you start to understand that there are no fundamental units of anything. Take the color spectrum, for instance. There is more than one color, right? Because if there were only one color, there wouldn't be color, because there would be nothing to differentiate one color from another. So the entire universe would look like a solid one color that nothing could stand out from. So we have a color spectrum. Now, my computer can separate probably, I think it's 16 million color tones. You could invent a name for every single one of those if you wanted to, and we do have names for all sorts of obscure colors like periwinkle, viridian, and all these things. But you can't really say that color is divided into units at all, because there's just the spectrum of color, and you can just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper into each little division. When you look at the rainbow, you know, it looks like there are 7 colors, but that's just the way the eye is picking it out. If I took Photoshop, I know we're kind of getting off topic here, but it's kind of relevant. If I took Photoshop and I put the sliders to red, it's very obvious. If you ask somebody what that color is, they'd say it's red. And then if I slid it to orange, people would say that's orange. But if I slid it halfway between red and orange, some people might say that's red, some people might say that's orange. But what color is it? Is it an orangey red or a reddish orange? Units slip away from us, and that's even true of the atom. It appears that atoms are real as Lego block type things, but when you get inside them, the electron is jumping around the universe in wave-like fashion. And I don't understand the math. I don't even pretend to understand it, but I know this is firmly established now. And the double slit experiment is a good way to learn about that, because it is something that we can actually wrap our minds around, the lay person like myself, that is. So, Michael, when you use the phrase, we are a unit of consciousness. So that's okay as long as we all bear in mind that the context that you're talking about is the classical context, where we live in a universe of separate things. But what I'm really talking about is underneath that. When you get underneath that, physically that would be the quantum, but the better term is simply the monistic, where everything is seen as an aspect of everything, and the only thing that is a thing in itself, as I tend to say, is the whole universe and whatever exists beyond perception, beyond space-time itself. The whole thing is one. Because when you get into the arena of things, in the classical sense, it's really only patterns, not things that are separate. You only see me here as a pattern against a background. So it's getting away from that sense that there are any things when there aren't any things. And although I was talking about consciousness, we can talk about anything. This object here only appears like a thing because there is a different chemical bonding in the molecules of the plastic from there is in the molecules of the air that is circulating around. Because the molecules behave differently, this pattern stands out from the whole. But there's really just the whole, you see? So when you say there is a unit of consciousness, I don't think you're really going to find that as a unit. Because neuroscience has had terrible trouble locating consciousness in the brain as a unit in the brain. It doesn't seem to exist that way. You could argue that, we'll find it one day, but somehow I doubt that's the case. Subjective experience, which is what I mean by consciousness, is a really unusual thing. And when I say there's no I, what I really mean is there's no I as a separate unit fundamentally. Yes, there is the experience of there being a separate unit, which is you're experiencing it, I'm experiencing it. I can't see inside your head, you can't see inside mine. But that's just patterns in the universe. And the universe is the only true I. So it's not that I is not real. I is very real. But it's kind of like saying big me is real, little me is not real. Now, again, what tends to happen, and this is what happened with the user I'm you and you're me. I forget his name. Sorry about that. I'm you and you're me. He was saying, but it doesn't, okay, I get that it's non-dualistic, it's monistic, but it doesn't feel non-dualistic. I feel separate. Well, let's really examine what we mean by this word consciousness, this really important word, consciousness. Because what I think is really going on, and this is where a lot of my thinking comes from, I'm trying to guard against a mistake that people make that I tend to call a lingering monotheism. So you go sort of halfway with the monistic perspective, but if you keep coming back to this idea that I'm a unit, I'm a unit of consciousness, then there's this sense that you have to somehow reach big me, the other me, that you're not yet self-identifying with. But if the universe is one, there's nothing to connect the I to, because the I is the one. You get it? It's hard. I was watching a while back there, I was watching the documentary about that Beatles member, George Harrison, called Living in a Material World. And he was into the whole Eastern way of thinking. And I think he was with Hare Krishna for a while. But his whole attitude, at least the way I perceived it, it seemed to totally miss the point. It was all about I'm trapped in this material world that I kind of don't belong in, and I'm trying to reach something else beyond that. When you're it, that is the most fundamental realization. You're it. You're the I. You're the whole. There is nothing but the whole, and you are it. And as soon as we make the mistake of saying, yes, I understand that I'm a part of the whole, that's back to dualism instantly. That's not non-duality. That's not monism. So while you're sort of guarding against the loss of individuality, I'm guarding against something else, which is the loss of the awareness that the only real thing is you. Not in the solipsistic sense of I'm real and everything else is an illusion. Everything else is also you, but that you is one. Now, I'm in danger of getting all tangled up in my own thoughts here. There was something else I wanted to talk about. Yeah. The problem with keeping reverting back to classical thinking of a unit of consciousness, of me separate from the whole, is that you keep trying to reach the whole, but the whole is you. Fundamentally, the whole is you, but not experientially. Experientially, it is the self and the other than self. Now, why is that? Well, here's the thing, and this is where I really think what I'm about to say will alleviate your concerns. The only kind of consciousness that is possible is individual consciousness. The term pure consciousness is an abstraction that has no meaning. And we'll delve into the word consciousness, and I'll explain why. Consciousness only exists when there is subject and object. So right away, that's two. Can you think of consciousness as one, as oneness itself? That doesn't work, because if there's just the oneness without any object, then there is nothing to be conscious of. Therefore, one is not conscious. One is comatose. It's kind of like saying, this even works if you think about it in the monotheistic sense of God being a conscious mind. If there were no universe, if there were only God, would God be aware? Would God be conscious? I would say no, for the simple reason that there is nothing for God to be conscious of. There is just God's own being. So are you conscious if there's nothing to be conscious of? If there's no other than self? No, it can't exist. So this is why there is the appearance of other than self. And it can't be any other way. So you get people who invent terms like pure consciousness or infinite consciousness. Like back when I originally started to get into this monism, I was reading David Icke, who gave me kind of a leg up with this sort of thing and a push away from monotheism, despite all the other stuff that he's into. I did get that initial push in the right direction. He uses the term infinite consciousness, so I was always originally thinking, okay, there's me and I'm infinite consciousness, but somehow I still have to connect to the infinite consciousness. Whereas that was a failure to recognize that I'm it. There's nothing to connect to. If we even conceptualize higher orders of consciousness in a kind of spirit realm or an astral plane or something like that, and that may not even be true, but let's just do a thought experiment that there are higher orders of consciousness beyond human perception. If those entities are conscious at all, then that consciousness is not a consciousness of a spirit realm, but a consciousness of another material realm that is material to them. Because what we really mean by material is just the object of consciousness. So right away you can see that I'm kind of questioning even the word spiritual. Because if we think of spiritual as the opposite of material, that doesn't really quite work. Because if there is consciousness on a spiritual plane, that has to appear as a material experience to that consciousness. So this is where I start to realize that ordinary, ground-based, earth-bound, body-mind consciousness, this is the real deal right here in front of our eyes. We don't have to connect to some other form of consciousness. You're it, right here. There's nothing else to connect to in some transcendental realm. And even if there were a transcendental realm to connect to with psychoactive drugs or trance states or whatever, that would just be another material realm. Because we know the material realm around us isn't really solid in the material sense. It's a fuzzy, entangled quantum place, isn't it? It just seems this way. And it's going to seem that way on some other plane of existence. So let's just deal with what we have and realize, hey, individual consciousness is where it's at. And every consciousness that is real at all is individual. There is no oversoul peering down upon us, especially not one that we have to somehow interface with. Look at how much of Eastern thinking and spiritual thinking of an esoteric sense is concerned with getting out of this world and fixing the suffering of this world by escaping it and all that nonsense. When you fully realize that consciousness, by definition, is a subject-object phenomenon, then the only place you need to find with your consciousness is right here, right now, in the bodies that you have as individuals. So, I think I've said pretty much everything I wanted to say there. So, a good analogy for this that I think might help that other user, I'm you and you're me. A good analogy is, he was saying it doesn't feel non-dualistic. First of all, realize non-dualism doesn't feel like anything, because without the experience of dualism, non-dualism is nothing. It can't exist. It's one of those weird words where non isn't quite used in the normal sense, so of an opposite. Because think of the word sense and the word nonsense. Those are direct opposites. But duality and non-duality are not opposites. And I'm not just kind of making that up as I go along. I'll try to make you understand why. If non-duality has an opposite, then it is not non-duality. Because if there is an opposite, that makes two. So it's not non-dual. So the experience of duality has to be thought of as part of the non-duality. And not just part of it, it is it. Non-duality manifests as duality. It's the same thing. We have to get out of this. We have to get out of our heads this idea that this experience isn't working, and we have to get out of it and reach the other experience, when this experience is it. This is it. You're it. So it's kind of like saying, I see the world as flat, but I know it's round. Now, I know it's round, but I don't immediately look out at the beach or whatever and see the flat expanse of the sea, and I don't say, but I see it as flat. It's no good that I know it's round. I see it as flat. We don't get all frustrated like that. So why do we get frustrated when we know that the universe is non-dual, but we feel it as dual? We can't feel it any other way because all consciousness is dual as an experience. There's no other way to experience consciousness. So, Michael, individuality forever. I think the best way to model consciousness as a phenomenon is to think of it as a dimension of the universe in the same way that we think of space and time as dimensions. We understand perfectly well in science that space and time cannot be isolated from each other. We had to think of them as a single entity called space-time. The reasons for that are very complex, more complex even than I fully understand. But I tend to think of it in the simple sense that something can have no existence unless it has duration. And time, as something that moves forward, has no existence unless there are objects occupying space to give substance to the idea of time. Now, I think there is a third component to all this that we might call mind or consciousness. And that is simply the reason I think the reason why I think it's so deep is because I don't think the universe is real unless it's aware of itself. Is the universe real unless there is an observer? That's a question that's impossible to answer because if we're not here, we can't answer it. But flip that round the other way also, and is the observer real if there is no universe? Is consciousness real if there is no space for it to see? If there is no time passing for it to experience? No. So I think the space-time model of the universe has to be understood as mind, space, time. If you think of those three as all hyphenated together. So mind is a dimension of the universe, and that's why I resist defining it as a unit of consciousness within the brain. The brain is just the mechanism that focuses that dimension into this experience. And I honestly think that this experience doesn't arise within the brain. And in fact, I think the brain is within the experience. You know, space and time exist within consciousness as much as consciousness exists within space-time. So it is, of course, very easy to get lost in one's own theories, but that particular way of modeling the mystery of mind is the one that presently makes the most sense to me.